All right, so let's get started with our very first lecture on chapter 23. We're going to be looking at Asia, Japan, China, the Ottoman Empire, and Russia. So this chapter is going to focus on how did other regions of the world react or respond to the increasing power of the West, increasing power of Europe and the United States, right? The countries that, of course, were first to industrialize. So what are these countries, what are they going to do about it, right? Are they going to also industrialize and modernize and even maybe westernize? Or are they going to stay in their old traditional ways? And each country has kind of like its own little story. So let's talk about the rise of the West. So the rise of the West is a term that we use in AP World History to describe the fact that starting in the 1800s, of course during the modern era, we see that there is going to be greater economic power that the Western European countries, Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Netherlands, and of course later on the United States. These are all the industrialized powers, and they're going to start having more and more control over territories in Latin America, and then colonies in Africa and India. And again, the question is, what's going to happen when the West rises and the rest of the world weakens or falls? So, Ottoman decline. So let's talk about what happens with the Ottoman Empire, which of course is the one that is closest to Europe, right? And what we see here is at the start of the modern era, in the year 1800 or so, the Ottoman Empire is so huge. It is a tremendous empire, right? It has parts in Southeast Asia and Southeast Europe. This is known as the Balkans. Of course, it has territories in the Middle East, right? It has territories in North Africa. But it is surrounded by, Europe in the West. We have Russia. We have the Persians, right? So what's going to happen? Well, the Ottoman Empire is going to face off against their neighbors time and time again. And for the most part, the Ottoman Empire will tend to lose a lot of their battles. And as a result, they would lose because they lack the sufficient modern firepower that other parts of the world had adopted and developed for themselves. Now, part of the reason why the Ottomans kind of failed to adopt is because of the power of the Janissaries. Now, in the previous time era, in the early modern era, the Janissaries were, of course, the elite core of the Ottoman military. And they had adopted earlier versions of gunpowder. But the ideas of, giving modern firepower to common everyday soldiers was something that the Janissaries didn't want to give up because it will take away their prestige. Right? Remember, they are supposed to be the elites of the elites in the military. So they refused to adopt modern techniques in fighting and more modern weapons because they felt threatened that it would take away their elite status. And the end result is that, of course, the Janissaries and the Ottoman empires would lose battle after battle and therefore lose territory over and over and over. Now, sometimes they did win. Like there's this famous battle, this famous war called the Crimean War that took place here around the Black Sea. And the Ottoman Turks barely kind of win. And the only reason they kind of sort of win is because the British and the French were on their side. And they were fighting against the Russians. And the only reason the British and the French were fighting against the Russians was to make sure that Russia doesn't get too powerful. Because remember, the Europeans at this point, this is after the Napoleonic Wars, after the Congress of Vienna. So this is the time where the Europeans are working on that balance of power, right? Where if one country gets too strong, the other countries work together to weaken it. Well, At this point, the Russians seemed to be too strong, so the French and the British teamed up to fight against, or allied themselves with the Turks to defeat Russia. Now, besides external problems, they also had nationalist conflicts. And the hotbed of the nationalist problems is going to be right here in the southeastern part of Europe, what we now call the Balkans. And the first place where it's going to erupt is going to be in Greece. Now, the Greeks start rallying behind nationalist belief that the Greek people, who are Slavic, or many of them are Slavic, who are Orthodox Christians, right? Because remember, they're descendants of the Byzantine Empire. And of course speak a common language and have a common culture, that they believe, based on nationalist beliefs that had been spreading throughout Europe, that they should be independent from the Ottoman Empire. Remember, the Ottomans, of course, are Muslims, and the Greeks want nothing to do with this Islamic empire. So they're going to fight, and they're going to win, and they're going to create the modern-day country of Greece, and it was thanks to Europe. So the Europeans, the British and the French, sometimes they would help the Ottoman Empire, like against Russia, and sometimes they would hurt the Ottoman Empire, like they did when they supported Greece's war of independence. So here we see kind of like the big shift in territorial loss. So at the start of this time period, 1796, the modern era, Ottoman Empire controls all these lands, right, in the Balkans. A few decades later, right, all the Balkans are independent countries, and the people in those countries are organized through nationalism. So, for example, in Albania you have Albanians, in Romania you have Romanians, and in Serbia you have Serbians. And all these small little countries, many of these people are of Slavic ethnicity, so they have a common ethnic background with Russia, who is also Slavic. So the Russians are going to be big supporters of nationalism, independence movements in the Balkans, at the expense, of course, of Turkey, of the Ottoman Empire, who is going to lose all those territories. At the same time, the Austrian Empire, you see up here, they're going to want to also get their hands, and they're going to eventually start controlling all these little territories for themselves as they're expanding in their empire. On top of that, we have another kind of like nationalist movement take place in Egypt, where there's this guy, his name is Muhammad Ali, not the boxer, and he's an Ottoman general, and he is sent down to Egypt, and he decides that Egypt should be independent, basically. And the Ottoman Empire is really too weak to stop the Egyptians from breaking away. And it's kind of like a semi-breakaway. They're still part of the Ottoman Empire, but they have a lot of independence. They could run their own things. And one of the things that Muhammad Ali does is that he industrializes cotton textiles. So he starts bringing in Westerners, French and British people, into Egypt in order to industrialize the cotton textiles. And the Egyptians are able to mass produce cotton textiles to compete with Britain and France and other industrial powers. They're also going to modernize the military, which is of course something the Ottomans never did, and they're going to do this by adopting Western style fighting and uniforms and weapons and generals and everything else. So that's going to be a unique thing. The Ottoman empires are also going to have a lot of economic problems as well, and there's numerous reasons, right? The main reason is that they're going to lose land, they're going to lose people in the wars, and therefore they're going to lose resources and trade and production. And the Ottoman Empire is still dependent on kind of like land trade, which has kind of like shrunk even more than ever before. And they don't have a navy, not really. So they don't have much maritime trade. But they realize, at least some of the sultans of the Ottoman Empire realize, that they need to industrialize. They need to modernize, like build railroads and build telegraph lines for faster communication. So they start borrowing money from Europe. Right? They have French people come in. They have German people come in. These German and French investors are going to come, make treaties with the Ottomans, and this is going to lead to a very dependency. The Ottomans they're not gonna be able to build these things for themselves. They're gonna need foreign investment. They're gonna need foreign advisors to help build it for them. And what eventually happens, of course, is when you have such a negative or such an imbalance in the relationship, right, where you are dependent on someone and someone that has full power over you, what ends up happening is something called capitulations. So the Germans will tell them, for example, all right, we're going to build you a railroad, but you got to trade us everything you have at a very cheap price. And that special arrangement is between Germany and Turkey, or the Ottoman Empire. And you can't, if you want to build more railroads, it has to be through us. If you want to trade with someone else, you have to kind of ask us for permission. So in other words, the Europeans are going to have a great control over what's happening, economically speaking, in the Ottoman Empire. So Britain, France, Germany, those are going to be the kind of the main ones. They're going to have these capitulations, these kind of unfair agreements that favor foreigners and not favor the Ottoman people. On top of the capitulation, we also have something called extraterritoriality. And we're also going to see this in China. So basically, you have all these foreigners moving to the Ottoman Empire to, build telegraph lines or build railroads or canals and stuff like that. And they say, okay, look, we're going to live in the Ottoman Empire, but we don't have to follow the rules of the Ottoman Empire. So if the Ottoman Empire says you can't drink alcohol because it's forbidden by Sharia law, and you can't smoke tobacco because it's banned, or you can't drink coffee because it's banned, well, the Europeans say, look, those are your laws, so you can keep them, but when we're there and we're living in your cities, those laws don't apply to us. And we can't go around and commit murder, but your laws, you can't try us. So if we break your laws, you can't send us to jail. You can't press charges. And if you have a problem, then you have to, talk to our government about it. So this is what we call extraterritoriality, where people living in the Ottoman Empire, Europeans living in the Ottoman empires, are exempted from following Ottoman laws. So imagine what that looks like, where imagine you're an Ottoman person, you're a Turk, and you have these foreigners, and they're walking around doing whatever they want and breaking the laws and customs and traditions of your people, and they have special permission from your government to do so. So the treaties of capitulation, which creates this special status of extraterritoriality, are super unpopular amongst the common everyday people of the Ottoman Empire. Now, as the Ottoman Empire continues to keep borrowing from Europe, they're going to have more and more debt. So even though they're going to try to industrialize, they never will fully industrialize. And the more they owe money, the more capitulations they're going to sign off, the more extraterritoriality they're going to sign off, right? So the common everyday Ottoman Turks resident is going to look at the government and say, what the heck are you doing? How are you going to give away all our land or all our resources to these foreigners? You guys suck. So there's going to be a lot of protests against the government, the Ottoman Empire. And as we see in Europe, in Eastern Europe and Russia in particular, there's going to be a lot of anger against any minority group. So remember, in the Ottoman Empire, there are many communities of Christian and Jewish minorities, one of these groups include Armenians, and Armenians are traditionally Orthodox Christians. And Armenians who live within the Ottoman Empire, within Turkey, are going to be persecuted and attacked because the Turks are kind of like frustrated that they have no control over their empire, so they want to take it out on someone. And that's kind of like what we saw with the pogroms, which is those, coordinated violence against Jews living in the ghettos in Eastern Europe and Russia. So we see that kind of trend that wherever the minority groups are, they tend to be targeted of violence and persecution. Now, the Ottomans are going to try to reform. They are going to try to modernize. And the era of these reforms is known as the Tanzimat reforms. So the first kind of like guy to step up to try to create some reforms was this sultan who tried to put limits on the power of the Janissaries. And then the Janissaries rose up and killed them. So that wasn't very good. The next guy, the next sultan that takes over, his name is Sultan Mahmud. And here you see him in his glory. And he says, we're going to borrow ideas from the West, right? Which, of course, is going against centuries of tradition where the Turks and the Ottomans believed that they were so much superior to the West, to the Europeans, that they felt they could learn nothing. But by this point, by the 1800s, it's very clear to everyone that the West is advancing and improving and having, basically, controlling the world. So Mahmud begins to adopt reforms in the military, reforms in the government, and when the Janissaries rise up against them, he kills them all, basically. And he ends the Janissary Corps, which has been this big part of the Ottoman Empire since its start. But this Mahmud's reforms, they're the first set of reforms in the Ottoman Empire. So we see more infrastructure. We see equal status regardless of religion. We see more education that is secular. That means not religious education, which angers the religious scholars, the religious judges. They're called the ulama. And the ulama hated Mahmud, Sultan Mahmud, because basically he's taking away their high status. The ulama used to be the upper class along with the Janissaries. So they're going to reject and protest these reforms because it's going to endanger or weaken their upper class status. And out of these processes, the kind of like the biggest problem is corruption. Right, whether it's military or government, right, the Ottoman Empire was just filled with corruption, and which made tax collection and revenue very ineffective. A lot of money was being wasted because it's going to the hands of local officials. So like I mentioned, the Janissaries, they're going to try to kill Mahmud, but they're going to get killed instead. Mahmud is going to replace them with common everyday soldiers that are called conscripts. So you basically tell us the male population, you've been drafted to go to war, which is what the Europeans have been doing since the time of Napoleon. And basically these early reforms allows the Ottoman Empire to survive longer than it probably would have. Right, so the reforms are kind of keeping the Ottoman Empire alive. After Mahmud, we have other additional sultans who are going to continue with these reforms. And during this time era, in the mid-1800s, we have that era called the Tanzimat reforms. So they're going to address political issues, they're going to address social issues and economic problems that are spreading throughout the Ottoman Empire. So we see more universal education. So even some education is going to go to girls. We're going to see more rights being protected. Less religious influence in legal or in laws. So the Sharia laws aren't going to be as commonly used as before. And of course, the biggest protesters against these reforms are going to be the elites, right? Whether it's the religious, educated elites called the ulama, or the military elites of the former Janissary court. Now, the Ottoman Empire, regardless of its reforms, It simply had too many problems to deal with to be able to really recover and improve itself by the end of this time period, by 1900. So in Europe, the Ottoman Empire has the nickname the Sick Man of Europe. And because it was like part of the problem besides the economic issues is that the Ottoman sultans kind of go back and forth between being very liberal in adopting reforms that could possibly improve things and being very conservative and maybe like tyrannical. So like we have this guy called Sultan Abdul Hamid, and this guy he basically comes to power and he says all the reforms from the last like 50 years we're going to cancel it, and all the movements towards a constitutional monarchy we're going to cancel it. We're going to have an absolute monarchy again. All the power belongs to me, and everyone hates this guy because people are slowly adopting these new reforms and new rights and new freedoms and, you know, positive changes, and he kind of wants to bring it back to the way it was. And remember, the way it was sucked. That's why the Ottoman Empire was failing. So we have this internal issue of trying to reform and then the conservative backlash to go back to the traditional ways. And we have, you know, it goes back and forth, back and forth. So we have that internal conflict that really kind of like confuses, right, the Ottoman Empire. It really causes them to just get stuck, right, not progressing like the rest of, you know, the West, that like the rest of Europe might be doing. So the end result is that we have limited industrialization, so they're never going to be able to compete with Europe. We have some legal reforms, like they do eventually take away the Sharia laws. But remember, the Sharia laws are also the same laws that protect women and give Muslim women a lot of rights. Of course, they also have them a lot of restrictions, like you still see here with the veil. But some of the rights that women used to have under the Sharia laws are now gone because the reformers don't want to give women any rights. So again, we have some progress, some reforms, but not all of it's positive, and the industrialization that occurs is minimum, and only few people are benefiting. So we don't see like that large middle class that we would have seen in the, you know, Industrial Revolution in Western Europe and the United States. And then finally, we see a new group eventually. Remember I said there's like that internal struggle between the liberals and the conservatives, between the reformers and the traditionalists. Well, eventually we see a new group called the Young Turks. So the Young Turks, they were rebelling and protesting the Sultan. They're kind of forced into exile. They're kicked out of the country. They go to France, and guess what they start learning? Oh, they start learning Enlightenment and scientific revolution and all that good stuff and industrialization. And then they come back and overthrow the Sultan. And they have this big, wide, popular support. Now, the reason they become popular, besides that they want to bring out these reforms and kind of change the empire a bit, the reason they're so popular is that they want to unify the Ottoman Empire under Turkish nationality. Right, under nationalism, in other words. And this process is called Turkification. So they spread this policy that everyone in the Ottoman Empire has to, for example, has to speak Turkish instead of, say, like Arabic, which is, you know, another major language of the empire, because many of the people living in the Ottoman Empire were Arabs. So Turkification is this, you know, nationalism movement. And the problem with it is that the Ottoman Empire, as huge as it was, wasn't homogeneous. In other words, it wasn't just Turkish people. There were Turks, there were Mesopotamians, there were Palestinians, there were Syrians, there were Egyptians, there were Arabs from Arabia, right? There were Europeans, all living in this massive, huge empire. So when you start saying everyone has to have the same identity, some groups, like let's say Armenian and Assyrian Christians, are going to be left out. So the Young Turks are eventually going to gain control of the empire. They're going to push this Turkification on the people. Of course, people who are Turks are going to love it and say, yes, pride and support and loyalty and patriotism for Turkey or for the Ottoman Empire. But the non-Turks living in the empire are going to say, what the heck? What is this empire for if it's not for me? And if the Ottoman Empire is not going to work out for me, maybe I should create my own country, like, say, Armenia. So that is the Young Turks. They're gonna some of the reforms that they do bring. For example, some of the reforms that you're gonna bring universal suffrage, so all men, not women, but all men get to vote. Freedom of religion, always nice. Constitutional government, so they have like a constitutional monarchy. So even though they have a sultan, it's the power of the sultan is very limited. And this is the empire. These are the leaders of the empire that will keep running the Ottoman Empire all the way into World War I. And that is going to mark the end of the Ottoman Empire because they're going to simply pick the wrong side, the losing side. But we'll get to World War I in a future chapter. So that is it. That is the story of the decline of the Ottoman Empire. And next unit, we'll talk about how the Ottoman Empire finally comes to an end after World War I. All right, so we'll see you next time for the next video. We're going to talk about, I think, China? China? Is it China? No, Russia. We'll talk about Russia next time. All right, so that is it for now. Thanks for watching.